My name is Jim Rodriguez. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, How ACEs Awareness Can Break the Cycle of Intergenerational Trauma, panel discussion with parents. Our panelists are Cindy Stanford, Clarence Vampas, Diana Mendez, Ivelisa Black-Taylor, and Renee Heddich. Before we begin, though, I just want to mention a couple of things. In joining the webinar, you're all in mute to avoid any background noise. But if you come across any technical issues during the course of the panel, you can chat in to our assistant, our coordinator, who is listed in your chat. If there's any problems. And we're going to ask you to use the chat feature during the course of the webinar today. So if you have any questions or comments during the course of the webinar, please feel to chat them in. We'll keep track of them and bring them back into our Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. And if you have any specific questions, so we have a large panel today. So as you chat in your questions or comments, if you want to indicate who your questions are to during the course of the panel discussion, please do that. Indicate which panelist you'd like to respond to the questions that we have. And then just a reminder, as always, we want to remind you to sort of fill out at the end of this webinar. We're going to ask you to complete a survey and give us some feedback, but also give us ideas of any other offerings that you would like on this topic or any other topic. And just a heads up, the recording of this webinar, as well as the slides and any resources that we're going to talk about later, are going to be up on the CTAC website within a couple of days. We're going to have a lot of ACEs related resources available for folks, and those should be up within 48 hours. So again, thank you all for joining us for today's panel discussion. And just a quick note for folks who may not be aware of ACEs, we're not going to talk about ACEs and the ACEs study, but for folks who may be new to the topic, ACEs refers to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it was a study that was done in the late 1990s that looked at the prevalence of early childhood exposure to adversity. So folks were asked about their experiences prior to the age of adults, I should say, were asked about their experiences prior to the age of 18 where they were exposed to adverse experiences, things like abuse and neglect, parental mental illness and substance abuse, parental incarceration, and others. And they looked at the number of those exposures that they had, and then correlated them with health and mental health outcomes. And what they saw first was that there was high prevalence rates of adverse childhood experiences. So they were actually more common than we normally think. And then there were some serious impacts over time into adulthood, health impacts, mental health impacts. For those who want more information on ACEs, as I said, in a couple of days, this and other ACEs resources will be available on our website, so you can take a look at those. But what we wanted to do today was really have a discussion with a group of parents who have a lot to say and have had a lot of experience with ACEs and can share with us their lived experiences around this topic. And before we start the panel, I just want to mention that of late, there's been a bit of research that's been coming out, and I've been heartened to see some good research. What we're going to be focusing on today is this relationship between parenting and parenting with ACEs. We have folks on our panel who have their own ACEs, and we also have parents who have children who have ACEs. We're going to have that discussion in the course of our panel, but just a few details on what the literature is saying. And like I said, I've been heartened to see some new research coming on, which really looks at ACEs and parental ACEs and the impact on children's behavior. And a couple of things I just want to note. So one study has shown that parents who have a high ACEs, their own high ACEs, 4 or more ACEs, are more likely to have children with behavior problems. That's not the surprise, because we've known that for many years. But the relationship is attenuated by parental stress and aggravation. So obviously, and not every parent who's been exposed to ACEs has high levels of distress and aggravation, but obviously for those who do, the difficulties in child behavior can be seen, which speaks to the importance of dealing with parents as parents and supporting parents in our work moving forward. There's also high parental ACEs is associated with harsh parenting, but again, that relationship is attenuated, is lowered by higher PACEs. Now, PACEs refers to uh, positive and compensatory experiences. There's a lot that's been coming out. One of our panelists, Cindy Stanford, has been doing a lot of work on positive childhood experiences. But the idea is that in addition to ACEs that folks can be exposed to, there are also positive experiences that can help. And so again, increasing and focusing on those positive experiences in childhood, both for parents and increasing the opportunities for those positive experiences for their children becomes incredibly important in our work. And then parent ACEs is also associated with social emotional problems through parental mental health, but only in the absence of emotional availability to their children. So oftentimes the work with parents is in supporting them to be more emotionally available to their children, connected to their children. So obviously for parents who have ACEs, it can impact their ability to connect to their children. And that's oftentimes a focus of the work. And then some recent research in last year showed that group interventions can improve parenting and mental health among parenting with ACEs if you are focusing on both. Sometimes our parenting interventions focus strictly on parenting, but some interventions that focus on supporting parents as well as teaching them and helping them develop new skills for their children is also incredibly important. So that's what the research is showing. I also wanted to share this brief video of a discussion between Nadine Burke-Harris, she's a pediatrician and the former Surgeon General of California and a leader in the ACEs awareness movement and the trauma-informed care community, talking with Linda Baggio, a Nigerian woman who immigrated from Nigeria and talks to Dr. Harris about her ACEs. So we just wanted to share this video with you, a brief snippet of this video.
Do it in a way that's evidence-based and trauma-informed. The data is clear. Early detection and early intervention improves outcomes. One of the things that I say often is that we have to put our own oxygen masks on first. How has learning about ACEs impacted how you approach your role as a mom?
I watched my father fight his ACEs. He didn't have the time to be vulnerable or the resources to support these battles that he was fighting in his head, the battles that I was fighting for a while until I had access to resources such as therapy. Because of that, that trauma was transferred over to me. This work helps you understand that intergenerational transmission of ACEs. And my understanding of that gives me more power to ensure that my son doesn't have the same ACE score that I do.
It's never too late to begin healing from ACEs. What this information, what the science does, is that it gives us tools to be able to determine our own futures.
So before we begin with our panel, we're actually going to have a quick word wall exercise. What we'd like you all to do is, our coordinator is going to put a link into the chat box that will allow you to contribute to our word wall. And what we'd like you to do is put into the word wall words that are associated with a world without adverse childhood experiences. What would a world without adverse childhood experiences look like? So if you want to take a moment to sort of link to that word wall and give your thoughts. We're going to keep that word wall open so you can open it on your computer or your device and add to it as we go through this panel discussion. And we're going to return to it at the end of the panel discussion and see what you all have shared. So we'd appreciate any thoughts or words that you can contribute to that. A world without ACEs, what would that look like? And so with all that said, I want to introduce our panelists for today, who will be sharing with us their experiences. Cindy Stanford is the founder and board president of ACEs Matter Corp. Clarence Bumpus is an instructor, founder of the Minority Mental Health Initiative, and a member of the Therapists of Color Collaboration. Diana Mendez is a family peer advocate in New York City and a regional parent advisor with Families Together in New York State. Renee Hettich is a lead Agape director and for the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York. And Ivelisa Black-Taylor is the Director of Outreach and Community Engagement for the Family Assessment Program in the Division of Youth and Family Justice for the Administration for Children's Services. All of these folks are out there working in the community, but they also are going to share with us their experiences with ACEs. And so what I'd like to do is start. So we're gonna, everyone's gonna be sharing first their experiences with ACEs, a little bit of their background. But what I'd like you all to do is share how you first heard about ACEs, your experiences when you first heard about ACEs, and what was your initial response when you heard about ACEs. And Cindy, if you can start us off.
Hi, I am I still have butterflies, even though I do this a lot. I still get butterflies. I still get butterflies. So thank y'all for having me. As Dr. Rodriguez said, I am Cindy Stanford, geographically located in Orlando, Florida. I learned about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study at a copy machine. And I share that because I was in a six-figure job. And I consider that six-figure job to be a privilege. Had I not been inside of that privilege, I might not have ever become aware of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And that was in 2020. So it was in 2020 that I learned about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study because somebody had made a copy of the 10-question quiz for a training that they were doing, and they left one of the sheets on the copy machine. And it was my time. I was up next. So I moved it to the side. I was doing my thing. And of course, as educators, we're nosy. I see it on the copy machine and I start reading the questions. And as I started reading the questions, I was like, this is very personal. Who's doing a training on this? And it was at that moment in February of 2020 that I picked up the phone and I called my cousin, who is the only other person that knows the intimate details of my childhood. And it was in that moment that I learned my cousin had also learned about the ACEs study just a few years prior in a random training. So I like to share that story because I created ACEs Matter so that people would have an opportunity to be introduced to the information on ACEs in a proper way. And then the other part of your question was, how did it influence, what was my reaction to it? I want to share that I went through the cycles of change, right? There's 6 of them according to some research, right? And I will say in 2020, it was a lot of loss, doubt, and discomfort because for a while, I thought I just got lucky. And even with my ACE score of 14 out of 15 on the extended study, I had a pretty crappy childhood. And for all this time, I just thought I had gotten lucky. And it turns out the opposite of ACEs were in my life, even in spite of a lot of the adversities that was going on, which is what James mentioned earlier about the positive childhood experiences. So I bring that up to say ACEs changed my life. And I'm now in the cycle of change of what they call integration, which is why I'm here before you doing the work of ACEs Matter as a nonprofit, so that people who grew up like me, who look like me, who may be on the other side of privilege now, have an opportunity to learn about this information so that it doesn't become a shock initially. So basically started the nonprofit as a result of me learning about ACEs. So thank you. You're on mute, Jim.
Sorry, Clarence. Yours.
Wow. Thanks for having me. Cindy, as usual, you kind of shut down the show, so I don't know how to follow that. My name is Clarence Bumpus, geographically located in the state of Colorado, born and raised where I have accumulated my original ACE score of 8 plus and my extended ACE score of about 13 to 14, depending on how you view it. I originally came across ACEs with the individual who actually introduced me to Cindy before I became a reacher in her program. Before I began my pursuit as a mental health clinician in my graduate program, I discovered the Everest childhood experience as a Division I football player, right? And getting ready to declare for the draft and all these other things back in like 13 or 14, and realizing just how many things I had gone through in my life, right? As a young Black boy in a minority poverty stricken situation, right? Surrounded by a bunch of faces that didn't really look like me, trying to navigate those spaces. And then I learned how to kind of normalize a lot of the adversity, right? So when I started learning about it, it didn't really make much sense. It was more like, what do you mean? That's not an adversity, right? Like not having food, that's normal, right? Like not having parents around being yelled at, humiliated, all these things, that's normal. And it wasn't until I, as Cindy was kind of saying, gained the privilege through access and exposure, right, that I increased my own awareness surrounding the abnormality, right, of all these adversities and how a lot of them kind of create a lot of impairment to functionality, which is what is, I say this all the time to the younger athletes that I work with. I call it one-dimensional thought process, right? Because it's kind of a limitation. It puts you in this box of, I have to do this because this is the only thing that I can do, right? And it's not adding to the quality of life, right? To say the least. And so to add to the last piece of it, I think that by becoming more aware, right, it changed not only my life, but it's changed the trajectory of my family history. As I raised my young biracial Latino and African American son, right, in the same kind of environments, but with a more regulated and settled sense of self, right, I can help him navigate that space. And that's kind of the reason that I joined ACEs Matter, and I'm still doing the same nonprofit advocacy work to raise the awareness and decrease some of the stigmatization. So, yeah.
Thank you, Clarence. Diana, how about you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Mendez. I'm a parent advocate who's been in the field for 25 years. I'm also a credentialed family peer advocate who works with families together in New York State, contracted by the Office of Mental Health. I am a mother of 2 adult children, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. And my job at Families Together in New York State is to support and provide resources to family and youth peer advocates. And how did I first learn about ACEs? I first learned about ACEs back in May of 2022. I was asked by Dr. James to join a new initiative called the New York City Resilience Collaborative team that is part of the New York State Trauma Informed program, which includes connecting with advocates to provide access to quality resources. As we moved on to the topics, he began talks on ACEs and the various ways parents and caregivers can be impacted by those ACEs as children, and how our own history can create challenges in raising our own kids. So my initial response was, what is this ACEs? What is this all about? And so I decided to take the test. And to my surprise, I checked off a few of those boxes. I then realized that I had been impacted by the ACEs in a variety of ways, and how that had how I myself had direct exposure as a child, leading me to question my own parenting skills and the challenges I faced while raising my own children. There was a lot of work to be done, including researching my mother's own past traumas. How has my awareness of ACEs impacted how I parent? I was raised with a mother and a father in the household, but my dad gambled a lot and my mother was always worried about how the rent would be paid and she raised 5 kids on her own. It was 5 of us, ages 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I was a twin with my sister. And I also learned that she actually endured a lot of trauma, herself. And there was a lot of fights that went on at home. And I was really affected by it, and my sisters. And once I learned about ACEs, I started to question my own parenting skills, and come to think of it, I realized that my mother was her mother had left her, and here I was, watching her as she came, at 25 years old to New York City on her own to make a life, only to find that my father was doing things that he shouldn't have. But I began digging deeper, and I found myself worried about everything, in my future, and would my husband walk out? And that's when I realized, that I was really um not doing the right thing by my kids. I was actually making them worry more and more and more. And so, I felt that, I monitored every move that they made, and in looking at ACEs now, I realized that I did more harm than good. I would tell the kids if they step out, is your phone charged? Look behind you as you're walking. Don't talk to strangers. Not to mention all the calls that I had actually shared, and told them, are you okay? Don't forget, call me back, call me back. I realized as my children told me this, they said, you know what, Mom? You're always worrying. You worry too much. And why are you so negative? And I took this statement really personal, because to me, everything I told them was because I cared for their safety. Now, actually, bringing what I was doing was bringing these negative energies and trauma to them. So I'm still a work in progress, but I realized I needed to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. There it was staring me in my face, and I realized, wow, I was doing this to my kids. And that's 4 generations of family trauma that were affected.
Thank you, Diana. And we're
Thank
going to
you.
talk more. We're going to talk more about the parenting aspects, but thank you for starting that discussion, and we'll talk more in the next topic. But I appreciate you sharing a lot of that's gone in your life. And Ivelisa, how about you?
Hi, good morning. My name is Ivy Lisa, again, Black Taylor. And my primary role, as Diana discussed, I am a parent first of 3 children. My oldest is 35, who I had to the age of 15. I have a 17-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old granddaughter. Um, I am also employed with ACS. I've been with the agency a little shy under 30 years. What else? There's so much to say. Oh my goodness. How I first learned about ACEs was in 2010. But I could say way before, at 11 months old, when I lost my mom, ACEs kind of fell on me, but I just didn't know what it was at the time. Um, and I remember I was completing an educational leadership program, and I was trying to find the perfect place to do my internship. And I was walking through the train station, and I happened to see a business card on the floor. And I picked it up, and it was from this organization called Youth at Risk. So I said, I'm gonna call, I'm gonna see if I can, possibly do my internship there. And lo and behold, I got in. And through this program is where I first came to know about ACEs. So I remember one day in particular, we were on this retreat and we had to formulate a circle. And the questions that were in the ACEs questionnaire were given. And for each question that we identified with, we had to take one step out the circle. And depending on how many of those questions that we had the experience with, we would, step closer and closer to the center of the circle. And when we all looked around, there was no one in the circle anymore. And what that showed me, well, my initial response at the time was that we have more in common than not. Even though we might have traveled different, routes to get to where we are, but we all started from some place of, of having some type of, adverse childhood experience. And it goes deep, and it just cut me deep. And at the time, I really didn't understand it, but it allowed me to open up and empathize with others more. And because, I lost my mom at such an early age, I also have four older brothers, and we were all separated. We were all in the foster care system, separated from one another. And my paternal grandmother had came and got all of us. But because I was only the child of her son, she couldn't keep my other four brothers. So they went off to be what my maternal side of the family. So I've always had kind of attachment and abandonment issues, but I didn't know why. So that goes into the story of how I became a parent at 15, because I just thought everybody that met me, that came into my purview, was somebody that that liked me, loved me, and wanted to be a part of my life. And so when I got older, I found that wasn't so much the case. But all that to say is that another when it hit home for me is when I was studying for my MSW, and we actually had to take the questionnaire. And when I took it, I scored a score of, I think it was sixes. I took it this morning and my score is still the same. But that's when it hit home for me. And I said what I learned, and as many of my colleagues and my friends and my family know, I'm what you are known as a career scholar. I have just a love for learning. I'm always, always have to learn, and that's what led me to this panel. So when I learned about it, I had to share it with everybody. I did it with my family, I did it with my friends, and I said, this is something that can possibly change the landscape in the way, the way we interact with one another. So that was my initial response. And I just want to learn as much as I can learn, so I can definitely, be a, effective impact to the communities that I serve.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Agnesa. I want to thank you all, because I realize, and just for everyone in the audience as well, just a reminder that as folks on the panel share their experiences, I just want to thank you all for being so courageous and putting yourselves out there and sharing your experiences here. And then finally, I want to sort of bring Renee into the discussion as well. Renee, your experiences with ACEs.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. I agree, Jim. I'm just so honored and privileged to be here. And I want to thank the panelists for their openness and their vulnerability so that we can learn and grow. My experience is slightly different. So I work for the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition and been working in the field of child welfare for over 20 years. But more importantly, 30 years ago, I became a foster parent. And 30 years ago, we didn't know, right? I knew my children were hurting and were from hard places, but that's all I knew 30 years ago. Fast forward 20 years ago, I began building my family through adoption. So I was a foster parent, I was a kinship parent, I'm now a foster parent of 4 children. All the 4 children came from international countries, 3 from orphanages and 1 from a foster family. And when my second child came home from an orphanage in China, I was at the same time working in the field of adoption and working with other families of international children from orphanages. And as I was working with them, I just noticed these patterns of experiences, patterns of behaviors, patterns of developmental dissonance, and was just curious, what is the common thread, right? So I kind of dug into the research and trying to find what I could find. And I first came upon, the effects of institutional care and deprivation on children. That was kind of the base that I had 20 years ago. And then shortly after that, I just really stumbled upon, just like many of you did, stumbled upon the information regarding ACEs. And it was like an aha moment. I'm like, this is describing my children in my home. This is describing the children that I'm supporting in other adoptive homes across the state. And it really allowed me to understand my children, appreciate the impact of their early childhood experiences on their current and future social emotional health, learning challenges, developmental issues, behavior, right? All of those things. And it really allowed me to look at my children in a new way and to approach my children in a new way. And I know we're going to be talking about parenting a little bit later on, so I'm not going to go into that yet. But I would also say, part of the question was, how did it impact me? And beyond how I now reframed how to parent my children, right? And I parent them in a very different way. It also changed who I was, right? So before my knowledge, I was a school administrator doing, right, grant procurement, bringing in money, doing that kind of stuff. And then my children arrived, as one of my children is peeking out from the doorway, sorry. As my children arrived, you know, I began to dedicate my life to children with a history of adversity and toxic stress, right? Changed my career, went back to school, and entered a new profession 20 years ago because of my now understanding of adversity and resilience. And I think that's actually the key for me, is my children come to me through a lens and a history of adversity. My role as the parent is to support their healing and their resilience. So thank you again for having me part of the panel.
Thank you, Renee. And so, you know, and to your point, I think we're going to switch now and talk specifically about parenting. I know, as I said, Diana mentioned a little bit, and you mentioned a little bit about how it's impacted your parenting. But I want to focus on that now. So let's talk about that for others. How did your awareness of ACEs? Well, first, one of the things that we want to be aware of is, and this is one of the things that is critically important, especially working with parenting, right? Our systems sometimes are built, right, to support either children or adults, right? And sometimes in working with families, there might be some family work going on, but sometimes we can live in a siloed system, right? Let's work with your child who has behavior problems, but you know, we're not going to be so concerned about your history. So, but I do want to start with you as individuals. So how did your awareness of ACEs change your personal narrative, including your healing? Cindy, I know you wanted to start off, but how did it change your personal narrative as an adult, as a person, as an individual? Hold off on a parent, and we'll talk about parenting in a minute.
So I'm going to say I can build off Ivelisa, Renee, and Diana. And anybody that's listening, you're going to see so many commonalities once you come to this information. But Diana talked about checking off boxes. So I'm going to say that my shift happened when I moved away from checking off the boxes of like what my own personal traumas were. And I immediately did the ACE quiz for my daughter. So I was a single parent for the most part of my growing up, had a child at 22 years old. And when I learned about ACEs, it wasn't, of course, in 2020. It was actually when I started taking gradual steps down what I call the rabbit hole. I realized that of the first 40-something years of my life, I had been looking at the problem out the window. I was looking out the window thinking, oh, it's everybody else. It's everybody else. And I think what ACEs did for me personally, once I started going through the cycles of change, it helped me realize that the reason why I was looking out the window and not in the mirror is because I was living life based on a trauma-infused lens. Totally different from a trauma-aware lens. Everything was fear-based, as Diana talked about. You know, it was just like, that was my eyes were infused with trauma. And that was the only way the chemical reactions knew how to respond to the environment that I was presented as a child. And so it was in that moment that I realized that I was not in control of some of my adult responses, that it was the chemical reactions that were relying on the trauma responses from my childhood, full circle. And so I will say the mirror versus window became very magnified, and I was able to do more internal work. And I'm going to close this out before we get into the conversation on parenting by saying I went from having a relationship with my daughter where she was trying to actively divorce me, like she was going to the courts to divorce me when she was a child, because I thought it was her the whole time. She was just being a brat. running away, trying to take her life. Like, what do you have to be depressed about? I'm paying the bills. Like, it was all of that negative parenting that I had experienced growing up that I thought she should just be grateful. We always say, what do we want our kids? We want to be grateful. We want them to be respectful, da, 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 da. And I only knew how to gaslight. Like, that was the tool I had. And little did I know that I was gaslighting my daughter at the time. So full circle, the mirror work was so helpful, because now me and my daughter are going to Canada for her college graduation trip next month. So she went from trying to divorce me, the woman she couldn't stand, to now we spend hours on the phone together. And I could not get to that place until I did the inner work. So I hope that's helpful for somebody, but it definitely, once you learn about it, it's easy to focus on looking out the window as this is everybody else's problem. But even if you don't have traumas, it starts with, how am I seeing people with trauma?
Clarence, I know you had some thoughts about this as well. How did it change your personal narrative?
Cindy does it again. Thank you for sharing, though. And thank you for the question, Jim. So I have this unique situation in which, when I started learning about ACEs, right, and scores, and I took my first assessment, I then experienced my first adverse adult trauma experience, right? Adverse experience. And it just coupled on. And so it was more like a complexity, right? And so what happened was, in my undergraduate year, same time I was trying to do all this like research, I had lost my first child to abuse, neglect, and you name it. And that situation right there activated some of those old ways of coping with the stresses of life the way I knew how, right? Which is what my exposure was at the time before the awareness, right? So the drinking, the drugging, the promiscuity, the high risk behaviors, right? You name it, right? I had bought it hook, line, and sinker, because even though I started to kind of shift and grow into myself as a more aware and self-responsible individual, I was still navigating the world of adversity to the max, right? And so I guess, to answer the question in short, what it did for me was provide enough awareness to take accountability for things and start to reevaluate the way I was moving, right? And how I really wanted to be seen and how I wanted to enjoy my life versus what narrative I was subscribing to based on what I had seen and what was continuously happening to me outside of my control. And the last shift in that, so like I had lost my son. And then I still was in the process of trying to finish my undergraduate year and declare for the next portion of whatever that was supposed to look like. And then I tore my pec around the same time. And so I had literally started losing everything at the same time, which, again, as Cindy was kind of saying, right, it brought me from the window, right, to the mirror, because I had to start asking deeper questions, right? Like, everything that's happening around me that's out of my choosing and out of my actions, right? I can't control that. And so why would I continue to deteriorate or self-sabotage? Because I had worked myself into a place of privilege through like all of the adversity, right? And so I started overperforming, right? And kind of like Ivy Lisa was saying, right? Like that bookworm ability, right? That quest for knowledge, for me, was born straight out of, excuse my language, oh shit, I don't know what else to do, right? Because football is now gone. Right, football is now gone, and you don't have a choice but to use what you got. And since what you were doing is no longer working, how do you reinvent? And so I was losing a sense of identity, right? Because I had lost a huge piece of myself. And so to rediscover, I needed to know where I was, and I had to have a starting point. And I think that's exactly what the ACEs assessment kind of did for me. And that's where I'll stop before I soapbox.
Thank you, Clarence. You know, Clarence, your response and your story remind me of, right, the mantra of trauma-informed care. is, kind of trying to help people move from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. We often talk about that mantra, right? It's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. So when you talk about your awareness of ACEs and sort of doing that self-reflection, that's what led to that personal accountability, right? I'm assuming not people telling you everything that's wrong with you, or even for that matter, you telling yourself what's wrong with you.
100%, right? And just accepting what has taken place that has made me feel that, right? And as I continue to grow, right, and continue to learn and cross paths with individuals of like experiences, right? Kind of like what my colleagues were saying on the panel, right? We start to realize just how common we are, right? Even though we start to see ourselves as different and we start to pull ourselves away. And I think that COVID, right, this whole pandemic piece did a wonders to that ACE thing, right? Because most of the kiddos whose social emotional development was disrupted, that just created more stress in home, right? Which just reactivated all of the parent stress that they thought they had overcome, right? And so I think that this piece right here and being able to talk about it in spaces where it's accepted and there's space held to normalize it, right, is what is necessary, right? Because the social distancing and all of the other pieces just kind of exacerbate the loneliness, right? The anxiety, the depression, right? The loss of identity, the loss of community, and all these other things. And I think that this piece right here is necessary just so we can express those commonalities and bring about the connectivity, right? The reconnection. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Clarence. And so as we shift, I know we've been touching on it here and there on the parenting aspect. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about how has your ACEs awareness impacted how you parent. And I know, Renee, you have a lot to say about this again, because as you said, it's changed dramatically. So if you want to start us off.
I reflect back on something that Clarence just mentioned. That is,
oh, Renee, your mic is low.
Is that any better? Okay.
Yep.
All good. Yep, all good.
All right, thanks. Before I kind of launch into parenting children from adversity, I just want to reflect on something that Clarence just mentioned. And that is, the layers of stress, right? Adversity is toxic stress, right? And for the children in my home, some of them came to me through foster care with very high traditional ACE scores, right? 7s, 8s, 10s, right? Out of 10. But then the children that are currently in my home, if you actually did the ACE traditional score, their score would be very low. But in the meantime, their history in those foreign countries was incredibly toxic and created incredible adversity. So although they may have a very low traditional ACE score, because of toxic stress and adversity, their challenges are consistent with somebody who has a high ACE score. So I just wanted to clarify that. And Clarence, I absolutely agree. You add the stress of the pandemic on top of that, right? And that really, I saw a major shift in my children. As a matter of fact, one of my children is homeschooled because of that. But to talk a little bit about, how does ACEs impact on how I parent? It changed everything, Jim. Changed everything, right? Understanding that changed, understanding how it impacts my child's development, behavior, mental health, completely changed my perspective on my child. Right, that was the core. It allowed me to look at my children in a new way, right? I came to my children with compassion and understanding rather than concern and confusion, right? Because now I was getting it, right? I try to look at their behavior through the lens of their history, right? And look at their behavior as a way they're communicating to me about what their needs are and how I need to help them heal. Not how I need to help them change their behavior, how I need to help them heal and be resilient. And that's a completely different way to approach your child and look at how to help them become the best that they can be, right? It goes from a very traditional approach of management, right, to a therapeutic approach of healing and discovery. Right? It has changed every way I interact with my children. And of course, as Jim knows, the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition also teaches foster, adoptive, and kinship parents research validated therapeutic parenting approaches, right? So in my own home, I work in a different way, but I also help other parents. But I do want to say this about probably the cornerstone of what really transformed how I parented was that I respected my children's self-knowledge. Right? They are the expert. I am not. They are the expert. And when I allowed them to teach me, that's when I could parent effectively, right? And I always learn more from my children than they're ever going to learn from me. And as a parent, we need to step down, acknowledge that, accept that, right? And move forward as we parent. So that's some base information for me. I want to allow the other parents to speak as well.
Thank you, Renee. And I love just it's about a mind shift. And, you know, we could talk a little bit more later, maybe about the details of what that might look like, but just the mind shift of moving from seeing them as a problem, correcting behavior, and thinking about how to help them heal. It's a huge shift in thinking. Diane, I wanted to come back to you. You gave some really good examples, and what you described is, we know that could be one of the responses, as you mentioned. I think you said, you know, it has impacted you. It made you realize, if I can label it, not to sort of over-label it, but how you became overprotective, or how you've, reflecting back, how you've been overprotective in some ways. And of course, that's one way in which a parent's own history of ACEs can impact their children. I see that a lot in my clinical work with parents when they become overprotective. Can you say a little bit more about other ways in which you, and I also really appreciate your perspective on this, because this is really new to you, and you're literally in the process of shifting.
Well, James, you know, I just want to share that when I spoke to my children about the ACEs, you know, and they told me that, you know, no wonder I'm always afraid, no wonder I think negative, you know, and then you throw in the mix of having a child. This is why I brought it up as, you know, when I introduced myself, having a child, oh, he's an adult now on the spectrum, that comes with its own trauma, you know, and he was bullied as I was bullied. So I had no choice but to listen, as Renee said, and says, you know what, I need to change what I'm doing here. And it was also affecting my marriage, because you know, the husband's going out to work, watch the cars, don't talk, I'm not even gonna call you no more on the phone, you know, and it just kept building and building and building. And I have to say that I'm learning, I'm still a work in progress, but I'm learning to self-regulate, because I truly believe that we're all surrounded by energy, and that energy that I have, I'm putting that on my family. And I was blessed enough we're a very tight-knit family, and I was blessed enough that my daughter says, you know what, you worry so much, I have an idea. Why don't we all agree right now to put on our phone locations, and this way you can monitor where we're at. You don't have to keep calling us and asking us, what is it that where we're at? Is everything okay? You're looking at our life, you know, with the phone. And that played a major role on the anxiety. It was like, woo. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful, and I'm still regulating myself, you know, and they've forgiven me. You know, to be honest with you, I sat one-on-one with my daughter, that she's 2 years older than my son. And, you know, and I told her about the ACEs, you know, and what I checked out, you know, not all of it, because I got, you know, things that I checked out there, but her response was, you know what happened happened, let's move on. So that's how that was left, and I want to share that with you, that again, we're all a work in progress. We're all a work in progress, and I think it starts with change and becoming that game changer, so that we stop that intergenerational trauma. There's 4 families involved in my case. I said enough is enough. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Dave. And Clarence, I wanted to come back to you because I know you talked a little bit about, your children. How has it changed? I know you, and of course you talked a lot about how it impacted you and your own accountability. I know you wanted to share how it's changed your parenting.
Thank you for asking. And ladies, thank you, right? Ms. Renee and Miss Diana. That's huge, right? And I appreciate that vulnerability. Thanks for setting the stage and normalizing it. Where do I start? So, as I kind of mentioned, similar to Diana's situation, right? After the loss of my first son, I went through all of the necessary steps to, one, avoid parenting, right? To avoid like actually checking out all of the things that scared me about my inability to parent, or what scared me about the way my parents, or my exposure to what it looked like, right? The modeling that I had. And so for the longest time, up until my second son, right, Keon, was born, it created the get the road ready for the child, right, personality, in which I was going to helicopter, and I was going to protect and save this man, and I was going to walk him step by step through life and karate chop any kid, any adult, right? I was going to rectify things, and that was my form of protection. And then I came across, obviously, tons of literature as I was doing some research and some research, right? And I ran across My Grandmother's Hands by Dr. Resma, his name. But right in this, he talks about kind of like what your kids are talking about, Diana, and kind of like what Renee and Cindy and Ivy Lisa was talking about, right? The integration of the trauma. We have to metabolize it at some point, right? And that's the strongest thing you can do. And so, full circle, right? Like, I started as a helicopter parent with this second kid. Like, I mean, skin to skin contact, you name it. Like, for the first 2.5 years, I'm the only parent at every doctor's appointment, right? I'm screening, I'm doing all the things, right? Like, I couldn't keep a job because he was my only priority. And unfortunately, but fortunately, it had created this microcosm of this false sense of security, right? Because in the house where it's just him and me and he's in my arms, I know he's safe. But I can't trust that, because that's not the way the world works, right? And the rest of the world is not that gentle, right? And so I guess I say that to say, like Renee is saying, it has informed my approach completely, right? To see the actual child, right, and honor the first 2 modes of expression, right? So the attitudes, the feelings, right? Like him not wanting to go to bed right away or take a nap and do all these things that usually generate stress, because, right, as a parent, right, we usually operate through control because that's the way we learned it, right? The classical conditioning, right? The cultural conditioning, even. We accept these things and we prescribe to these norms, right? And then we kind of learn about them, and then we grow into this. I'm never going to be like that opposite parent or that one thing, right? I'll be just like this parent, right? And all these other things. And we start to create all of the same traumas, just on different levels, but deeper, right? Like the overprotection turns into enablement and disability, right? To thrive and navigate social spaces securely, right? And then you throw in pandemics and you throw in all these other pieces, right? Out of our control. And so to accept that piece and to actually honor the first modes of expression and see the need behind the behaviors, right? Instead of just seeing the behavior only, which is where most of us have gotten. And I think you spoke to that in terms of clinical space, right? People want to treat the kid like the problem, and the adults, right, are okay with that because they're like, yeah, it's them, it's not me. even though what they're doing is basically another version of what I was doing. And if I don't understand that, then I'm going to keep doing what my parents did or think I'm doing it differently and just recreating or regenerating that cycle. Right. And so I personally have, Renee said it best too. Like, I personally learned so much from my son, Keon, right? About patience, about love, right? About compassion, about empathy, about being present, right? And about the ability to actually hold space. Because everything that that dude does has literally taught me everything about myself and the way that I move in the world and the way that I've seen the world view me, right? And so it's done a lot of that inner child work, but like it has literally put me in a position to get my child ready for the road and not try and get the road ready for him, because that's a impossible task, right? And it's incomprehensible, and it's the fastest way to distress, disappointment, depression, you name it, right? So, right, I am now able to operate with a love-based lens, right? I'm able to respond, right, and be present in the situation and regulate myself so that I can help him manage and regulate, right? Especially in those hot, tense moments where we're both frustrated and he wants to yell his little heart out. And I'm like, man, you know, if I was you, like when I was you and I yelled, I would have got my soul snatched, right? You would have touched my soul. Somebody would have, right, created a trauma-based reaction, right? Or a trauma response. And that's where we usually all go. And so instead of that, I'm able to like actually regulate myself and honor that expression, right? And I come alongside of it and I'm like, yo, I can see you're pissed, I can see you're frustrated. Like, if you need to, right, let's take some time apart, let's take a little space, right, and then we can come back together and you can help daddy understand where you're at, because that's what I needed as a kid and I never received that. And I've tried it as a parent and it seems to be working, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of those situations, right, where it has just molded me as an entire person.
Thank you, Clint. You know, I full transparency and just a little self share here. I actually watch with my wife has gotten me hooked on Spanish novelas, and so I watch them now. And there's a commercial that they're using. It's a public health commercial, and it's amazing. It is exactly what you're describing. It is parents like banging on their children's door because their children are acting out and yelling and screaming, and then they stop themselves and they take a step back. But it's like I was so, when I saw that commercial, I was like amazed. I was like, that's what we need to be teaching. But it was definitely stop, self-regulate, catch yourself before you go out of control. It was so great to see in that. I want to bring Renee in, and then Ivelisa. I know you had a response also to parenting, but I know I could see, Renee, you wanted to make a comment. Oh, you're on mute, Renee.
Thanks, Jim. I'll make it quick because I'm anxious to hear what Ivelisa has to say. But, you know, thank you, Diana and Clarence, for, again, being so vulnerable and sharing your story. You know, and what I'm hearing from you and what we know is the key to therapeutic parenting, the key to helping our child heal is the well-being of the parent, right? And that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say because I want to, you know, allow Ivelisa to share her wisdom. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will say just a ton of research to show that parental mental health is child mental health. And we've there's reams and reams of research demonstrating that as well. Ivelisa, your experience with parenting.
Oh my goodness. All I have to say is, oh, we have so much in common on this panel. It's unbelievable. Like Clarence said, you know, it's hard. It's a process. And for me, you know, one of the quotes that sticks in my head is to first seek to understand, then to be understood. And I have to check myself, even when my kids come to me and you know they have a question or they say something, I have to check my mood first before I even respond, because I need to de-escalate from whatever it is that I already had going on in my head. So I want to make sure that I'm not judging, I'm not blaming or shaming in that moment. You know, depending on what it is that they're coming to me with. So just checking myself and making sure I'm in a place and space where I can receive whatever it is that they're bringing. Um, but how it shapes me is that we have come such a long way, because like I said, I had my daughter at 15, and this was not, I wasn't the same parent that I am now to her that I am with my other, and even with my 17 and my 12-year-old, it's different, right? And then and like I said, the reason why I said it's a process before, because when you look out the window, you see all that is happening around us. And like Clarence said, I just want to take my babies and I just want to keep them near me at all times. I don't want them to go out for anything. But at the end of the day, they have to live and experience their life at their own level. And one of the things that I like that Diana said is that, creating that space where they can come and feel that, mommy, I know you're worried, I know you're scared, but this is where we're going to be. Just keeping those dialogues of communication open, whether it's through text, phone conversation, whatever, but just always keep me in the loop. And I think as parents, we just tend to fear the worst, and especially coming from our own upbringings where, I wasn't allowed to go out like that. I wasn't allowed to spend a night out. I wasn't allowed to be with my friends at the level that I wanted to be with. So a lot of that is still kind of, ingrained in me. And I'm trying my hardest to let it go and be a little bit more freer and understanding with my children. But like I said, it's a process, especially with everything that we see going on around us. Um, and in the work that I do, and seeing what I see every day, working in detention and how the kids got there, it just makes it even harder. But like, Diana said again, but we got to trust in the universe. We got to trust in what we impart in our children. Like they say, train up a child in the way they should go. And I'm a true believer of that. So if I'm believing in that, then I got to stand on that, and I cannot let fear be my dictator. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ivelisa. So
Mhm.
folks, I realize I'm aware of time, and this discussion has been so amazing. But I realize we're running a little bit back on time, and I want to make sure we allow the audience and give time for the audience to bring any questions. So what I want to do though is I want to see if each of you could just really quick, this is for the systems, and actually, Ivelisa, you just mentioned, right, the work that you do, you all work out there. If you could briefly mention what is the one or two things you think are critically important for systems out there, our mental health system, our child welfare system, our educational systems. When we think about the notion of parenting and ACEs, what is the one message you want to give providers out there, or systems providers and folks within those systems, a message about parenting with ACEs, and what they can do to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma? So I know we kind of went through a little bit of this in preparation. It might be a little bit more brief, but I want to see if you can. And I'm just going to do a quick go around. So if you could briefly mention it. So on my screen, Diana, do you mind just giving your thoughts really quick on what you think the systems need to do to become more trauma informed and ACEs aware? You're on mute, Diana.
I truly believe that it goes back to training, to taking the time out, to train. The providers need to take the time out, and I know that they're tired of that word training, and being empathetic, because once you're empathetic, you're putting yourself in that person's shoes, and so you'll step back and say, wow, I'm gonna look at, he's no longer this client of mine. I need to, they have to change the lens. They have to change the lens. That's basically it. Change the lens of the individuals that you are working with, including those, that you're working, that are on the spectrum. Every other person's on the spectrum, right?
Yes.
Deep stuff, and keeping in mind that this world right now, we mentioning it over and over, we're in the worst times ever. So you have to keep in the back of your mind, okay, we're gonna fix you, but remember everything that's going on in between, that we trying to put this armor. But there's a lot going on. It's to a point that we're not even putting on the TVs no more. It's so frightening. And I leave it at that.
Thank you, Diana. And yeah, that lens, and I know we're doing a lot of work at the CTEC and trying to help providers in all systems change that lens. And you've all given some really good insights on what that means. Ivelisa, how about you? One or two things that systems can do to be more trauma informed and ACEs aware.
You use the baseline data from this wonderful questionnaire. I mean, that's a start. To create and customize the systems to meet families and parents where they are. First and foremost, to create safe spaces that are free from shaming and blaming, especially in the work that I do. You know, families are very afraid of ACS, some good, some bad, but creating these spaces that will not demonize them when they do share and tell their stories. And last but not least, always start with the end in mind by creating these strength-based approaches. And I wrote this down, that complement and support existing strengths and capacities. So that our parents can feel like they're a part, that they don't feel like what I say can be used against me. And also always affirming to them that they are not their past. They always have the right to create a new story. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to emphasize, I think, and I think that you said a set of wonderful things, but the shaming and blaming, I think that's one of the things that and I think if we bring that ACEs awareness lens to the work we do with parents, I think that'll go a long way to reducing the shaming and blaming that systems can oftentimes engage in. Thank you for saying that. Everything else you said as well. I want to really put a exclamation point on that. Clarence, what do systems need to do to be more trauma informed and ACEs aware?
I'm trying to be succinct about this one. First step is always be human, right? And stay present. See the person, treat the person, right? And not the problems or the symptoms or whatever the hell that is presenting, right? See the person first. Secondly, but primarily, do your work, right? And know yourself, right? Because if you can't hold space, right, and be the calm, you're contributing stress, right? And the stress is literally just fear. And unfortunately, most of us without awareness don't understand that fear and courage are literally one in the same line, because they all mix with a little bit of stupidity and risk and vulnerability. So stay vulnerable and stay human, please. Right? And don't forget that the clients, the experts, right, they have a story too. And no one knows their story better than them. So we got to hold space, right, to help them patch the pieces of their story, because we're not there to fix. They're not broken. They're not broken. They just need a little bit of love so they can heal through it, right, and move forward.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
Thank you. And I just want to, when you say know yourself, you're talking about the providers out there, the people doing the work and providing support and services. Yeah.
You dang Skippy, right? Because if we're talking about our service industry, right, and the other professional helpers, right, not only on the panel and the rest of the hope dealers in the world who are coming alongside those in suffering, right, understand that in order to help anybody else, you got to help yourself first, right? And so that has to come from a place of love.
Thank you.
You can't hold space in a fractured mentality, right? So don't project it, don't push it on people. And if you haven't done your work, it will present and it will cause more harm than help. So handle that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And that work on ourselves as providers, I think, is critical. Renee.
Thanks, Jim. So, I agree with everyone, of course. I think each of us needs to come to the table with compassion, empathy, understanding, and respect. But as Jim, you're asking, what can the systems do? I would ask priority be given to really three areas. One is parental resilience. We're going to move from intergenerational trauma through the parenting, right? And the way that we can parent and heal is through resilience of the adult. So I would ask for us to focus on parental resilience. I'd also ask us to focus ourselves on family-centered work. And Jim, at the very beginning of the seminar, you said it, right? We're sitting in silos. We're seeing only the child, we're seeing only the parent, right? We need to work as a family unit. Healing happens through the family. Right? So I think that's the other key. The other thing that I would really ask us to focus on is prevention and protection from ACEs, right? Put our resources in programs that are preventing adversity, preventing toxic stress, preventing trauma. That's the key, right, as we move forward. So those are the three focuses I would ask us to consider as we move forward. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Renee. And Cindy.
I've been over here itching. So again, we learn from the best. I'm just going to endorse with my little 3-year self of like going down this trauma rabbit hole. I'm going to endorse everything my colleagues have said, and I'm going to put it in a way that y'all just help make it make sense for me. I wrote these down, but as y'all said them, it went with everything I wrote down. First of all, with the system design, we need to think every single decision that we make in terms of programs and development should be done with 2 generations in mind. So kind of going to the parent and the child. The second thing is to create spaces for safe conversations, which has already been echoed. And when I say that, it goes back to Clarence and I think Avelisa's point. We got to do the mirror work because we may be providing service from a trauma-infused lens. And I was in my 40s when I learned about how the eyeball works and where that light is actually coming from. So we got to pay attention to what light is actually being transmitted through our eyeballs. A shout out to Heather and Teresa in the chat. We think we're awesome too. And a lot of work was put into us being able to bring this conversation to y'all. So shout out Teresa and Heather who's in the chat. I want to say to some of the questions that came up, which is kind of in alignment with what you all said, is there are going to be people that we try to bring this conversation to and they not ready. And that's okay too. However, system level, if we want to create safe spaces for these conversations, we have to find people that are vibrating on their level, because us who have been doing this work for 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 years, we may be a threat to that person's nervous system because we may be so far removed from their healing possibilities that they can't hear the words that are coming out of our mouth. So if somebody is not ready for that conversation, it's okay. Today, they might not, but the power of planting that seed, even when that person might get defensive, you have no idea how far that seed might grow. And then the last thing that I'm going to say for systems change is if we want to remove the fleshly aspect from this, the human aspect, yes, we want to treat people like humans, but let's be real. There are 40 trillion cells in our body that are controlling everything. So when we are teaching this information on adverse childhood experiences, we must include the science of how the body works. And when I say that, that is the 3 brains. I was in my 40s when I learned that there were 3 brains, the brain, the heart, and the gut. All 3 of those work together to heal ACEs. And if we are going into these conversations, think about addressing the flesh, we are missing the whole point. We have to teach from an adverse chemical experience, because all the toxic stress are chemical reactions. So these are adverse chemical experiences that we see as adverse childhood experiences. So every conversation that we start should start from what chemical reactions might be taking place with these 40 trillion cells that's causing this person to want to go shoot up a school. I pass my microphone. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, all of you. I want to, and I want to sort of bring it to question. I'm looking at many of the comments, and there have been many comments that have come through, and I have to say many of the comments are just supportive, affirming the messages that you've had. But questions, so we want to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions of any of our panelists. While we do that, though, Kiara, can you bring up our word wall to see what folks said about what a world without ACEs would look like? And while you do that, again, please feel free to chat in any questions. Just a reminder, if you have a specific question for one of our panelists, just indicate that. And I also want to mention that folks, if for you folks in the audience, people have been posting all kinds of resources as well. Thank you, Kiara. And I'll just mention those on the other side, but let's see. What would a world without ACEs look like? Wow. Wow, right? Peaceful. Cindy, I'm echoing your last comment. Peaceful. Some of the other words, please, panelists, please feel free to shout out any words you kind of connect to and see that are important. Supportive.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interject, but I guess this must speak to the level of like work, or it must be my trauma brain speaking, right? The traumatic superpowers it missed. Because when I think of a world without adversity, I think of a bland, right? I think of, what's the word in here? It says, I saw one, but it made me feel like there would just be uneventful. It would be uneventful. There would be no flavor, right? Because stress is a positive thing if we can get there and view it as such, just like anger. I just threw that out there because I think it would be boring as hell if everybody was just okay all the time.
Yeah. I appreciate that, Clarence. I always like to say, though, stress is going to come. We can't avoid it. But I think to Renee's point, there are things that we can do to prevent horrible things from happening, adverse and toxic things from happening. And I think those are some of the things that we have to be mindful of. And as a therapist, I always talk about being aware of the things you can control and can't control. But I think so to your point, yes, a world without adversity is just not realistic. However, there are things that we can do to prevent and promote protection and promote protective factors and promote health as well. There's always going to be adversity. People will pass on. But thank you for saying that, Clarence. Any other words? Compassionate. I'm seeing supportive. Without crime, without or crime. I have seen that. Opportunity. Nurturing. These are some of the words that are just popping out. I see heaven in there. Enlightening. Parenting healed. Thriving. So thank you for contributing to those. But again, just coming back to our audience, any questions that you have for our panelists? As I said, I saw a number of comments. Oh, here we go. Let me see. I'm looking at one here. Okay. I'm just going to read it. My grandmother is in the midst of her ACEs. How can I help her navigate her childhood so she will understand that she does not have to be the traumatic experiences that she is experiencing at this time? How do you tell this to the parent without getting defensive? Is there a website or workbook that would be good to start? So there's a few questions in here for a parent to start their journey. Can you share the video at the beginning of with Nadine Burke-Harris? Yes to that. The other questions, your thoughts, and I think this question sort of addresses the intergenerational aspects of this. Cindy, I know you all have, but Cindy, I know you're doing a lot of work in this space, but going back, and how do you help grandparents heal? And is that part of the equation here?
I'll take this one and try to be brief. When I started the work in 2020, I naturally assumed that because I'd learned it, everybody else was looking for this magic wand or bullet or whatever you want to call it. And I took this work to my family, and my family's pretty large. If you come to, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I'm doing a genealogy conversation with CTAC tomorrow. And what I did is I asked my family if they would take the ACE questionnaire. And most of them did it without hesitation. That was the easiest part. The part, again, that is not so easy is that person's readiness level to bring up those emotions again. And so to the person's question, I personally don't have a right or wrong answer. I can tell you that there are people in my family that just on a vibrating level, their cells are not ready to hear this conversation, because it does mean that I'm gonna have to confront this. And the advice that I'm gonna give the person is obviously starting the conversation with somebody that is trained is most important. Sometimes you have to go on no contact, honestly. Like if the person is becoming abusive to you or just not responding to that information, we talked about the whole mirror work. Like one, we want to be able to see our people as being successful, whatever that looks like. But again, that's not our role. And I would say, be the change that you want to see. And sometimes we have to be okay that this may not be the time for that person to come to that information. Be the change that you want to see. And the last thing that I'll say is, honestly, most times people just need somebody to listen. Yeah. And if you've done the work and you could handle listening, because, you know, obviously you can, sometimes it's so obvious to tell when somebody's still in the trauma because it'll come out in the words that they use. If you can handle that, if your stress response system can handle that, then just listen. And then ask the grandmother or the sister or the cousin, what role would you like for me to play in this conversation? You want advice or you want me just to listen? And if most times it's just to listen. And if you could let that person get those words of fear and scares off of them, usually that's a start to the healing process. But I'll close by saying it's really the mirror work. Like, how are we seeing our grandmothers? How are we seeing our sisters, our cousins, and all those people? Because at the end of the day, it may not be our job to try to change them, but just to leave those seeds along the way.
Yeah.
I wanted just to add a quick thing.
Absolutely.
That she just said. I think part of the healing process with the grandmother would be to remind, to talk to her, but remind her of all the goodness that she's done. She's came this far, so remind her, you did this, you did that, you're still alive. So that positive reinforcement, I think, would be very, very beneficial. That's what I wanted to share.
No, and thank you for sharing that, Diana, because I think oftentimes, and someone asked, right, how do you have this conversation with others without them becoming defensive? And what you're describing is a very good strategy, right? Start off with the positive, start off with the strengths before you have the discussion about how adversity might have impacted them or impacted your relationship with them. Renee, I believe, any thoughts about how, and I think there's questions in there about how do you have the conversations with parents without them becoming defensive, but also some of you talked about having conversations with your children. But Renee, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something Diana just said. And that was, the strength-based approach.
Renee, I'm sorry, you're a little bit low again for some reason.
I'm not sure. Is this any better?
Yep, sound a little better.
Just come a little closer. I just wanted to comment on something Diana and Cindy just said, and the importance of that strength-based approach and the fact that the validation of survivorhood. Right? I would say I had a foster teen in my home, and before he could move forward in healing and work in ACEs, he first had to claim the fact that he was a survivor. And actually his high school graduation cap had survivor on it. That was his graduation. And once he was able to claim that and know that he had the strength, then he was able to move forward in the healing process. So I just wanted to validate what Diana and Cindy said. Thanks.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I believe I want to get your thoughts in here too.
Well, in a lot of my work, I work with parents, I work with families who are at their wits' end with their children's behaviors. And, a lot of our work is done with the entire family, not just with the parent, not just with the child, but with the parent, as a whole, with the family as a whole. And a lot of our preventative services are done from a strength-based approach. And one of my favorite quotes is by Frederick Douglass. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken. It's the quote, the actual quote says men, but I like to change it and use adults. Because and speaking to the grandparents' points, I was raised by my grandparents. So it was nothing that they ever did wrong. It was like they was the epitome of right. And when I look back as my adult self, there was a lot of stuff that they endured in their childhood, which is why they parented the way they parent. So, when I look back, I forgave a lot of the behaviors. I extended a lot of grace, but we also got to realize where they're coming from. And as many years as it took for them to become that, it's going to take the same amount of time or longer for them to change that behavior. But like Cindy and Diana said, but plant the seeds. Just plant the seeds and start the conversation. We don't know where it's going to go, but we can always hold in our mind, what we think the outcome is going to be. But like I tell my parents all the time, you don't know until you start having the conversations. Okay? So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
We're gonna leave it there, unfortunately, because we are almost out of time. But I say that just a couple of slides. So these are just some resources and references. I just wanted to mention very quickly, there's a couple of resources that are here. They will be on the CTAC website in a couple of days. We have an ACEs brochure that we developed in consultation actually with Cindy Stanford, our wonderful colleague, that's available for folks to share in programs, in your waiting rooms and other places. I also came across in doing the research for this, a wonderful document called Turning the Tide. It is on the NCTSN website. The link is here. And you'll be able to find it on our website in a couple of days. And it's a great overview of understanding the Association of Parenting and Trauma. And it's a great resources for folks to look at. The other thing I wanted to mention very quickly. So as Cindy mentioned, we have a few events coming up along these same themes, understanding ACEs across generations. Our amazing colleague, Cindy Stanford, will be back tomorrow doing her work on ACEs genealogy and understanding how ACEs has impacted her throughout the generations, her family throughout the generation. Next week, we're going to have a conversation about intergenerational trauma with leading author, Dr. Galit Atlas. And we're going to have a conversation with her about intergenerational trauma and how to treat it. And then understanding ACEs on the journey to adulthood, a panel discussion with youth peer advocates. Our amazing youth peer advocate, Amber, will be leading that discussion. And that will be a panel of youth peer advocates who are going to share, similar to as our parent panel did today, their experiences with ACEs and their journeys towards healing. I want to thank you all for joining us today. You can go to our CTAC website again to find the resources for today's panel discussion on there. And please complete the feedback survey that you'll get at the end of this webinar when you log off, and give us some feedback, but also your thoughts about other topics you'd like us to address in this space. Again, I want to thank our panelists, our amazing panelists, our team here at the CTAC, and others who contributed to this amazing panel. I want to thank you all for being here today. You all, the audience, for being here today as well. And again, we hope to see you on some of these other offerings we have over the next few days. We're talking about ACEs. Thank you all again. Bye, everybody.